if you don't like what comes out when you're under pressure, don't blame the pressure. Change what's in.
That's good.
And that's kind of what we've seen in the church. We've seen like the pressures come out. We've seen some of this ugly stuff, or the pressures hit us and some of this ugly stuff's come out of the tube. What are we putting in there?
Welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, a podcast where a pastor and a rabbi get to the heart of issues that matter to people of faith. I'm Pastor Doug Reed, here with my friend, Rabbi Pesach. Well, on this episode, we are going to be having a conversation with Pastor Stephen Martin, a good friend of mine and now a good friend of Pesach's as well.
Pastor Stephen Martin has really done an incredible thing. Vintage Church is, as you said, it's 3 campuses, and the main campus there where we were, which was recently opened, is a fairly large facility, and we're going to talk about everything that they're doing there. And the main driver, besides meeting Stephen and saying, wow, we got to have him on our podcast, is what he's doing with his community, how he's structuring the community. And it's all been built in the last 12 years, which blew my mind. I could not believe about the rapid growth. So we're going to get to know him right now. This is a good time to bring him in. Pastor Stephen Martin, welcome to the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast at long last.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi Pesach. It was a great honor to have you in this weekend. And I will tell you, sometimes as communicators, we think we did a good job, but we want to ask the people who actually received our message. And can I tell you, you did a great job. Our people were just so excited. You took us deeper in prayer, and it was great to have you, Pastor Doug. Great friend. Good to see you again.
Excellent. And I want to remind our Shoulder to Shoulder listeners that we are not the only podcast. Pastor Stephen has a great podcast called the Under God Podcast. And you can go and catch that everywhere you listen to podcasts. So as well as pastoring a church, he runs a terrific podcast, has some great guests on there, some great thoughts. And so be sure to subscribe on Apple or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Well, Pesach, we got to get into this because I'm excited to unpack a little bit, but I want to start with the Israel piece. We'll get to the church stuff in a moment because Pastor Stephen and I were both on the same Israel trip in 2016. I came back and had drunk the Kool-Aid hard, as they say. I was all in on the Israel piece. And I kind of want to pick up there because you and I've talked about this a little bit. What was kind of your take coming back from Israel? You had just planted your church. That Israel trip was significant for you, but you've really re-engaged in the last little bit. And so I'd love to hear kind of your arc with the Israel narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a great church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Our pastor is a Christian Zionist. I mean, we were taught, early on as a believer, I was taught kind of Israel's role. The only thing was I didn't actually know any Jewish people. And so being invited, it was kind of more of an abstraction for me, but being invited to Israel really came at a great time, to be honest with you. It was a trip that was offered to both of us for free to be able to go and really connect and see the Holy Land. And we had just started our church. Things were not going super great. We were kind of going through one of our own kind of trials. And so I jumped on the opportunity just to get away. Little did I know, though, that trip would change the rest of my life. I mean, there's something about putting your feet on that ground, coming alongside the people, seeing their way of life. And it just really made the Bible come alive to me. So I come back and I was a Christian Zionist before, but now it was like hyperdrive. And so I always kind of kept up on what was going on. But really with the demands of the church and everything going on, I really didn't engage a ton. It wasn't until October 7th that I called a mutual friend and I said, okay, we've got to jump off the sidelines here. The Jewish people need our friendship and we are friends. So let's jump into it. So I've been a lot more involved. Our latest trip, we were there on the 1-year anniversary of the Hamas attacks. And our first night there, we actually had Iran shooting missile rockets into Tel Aviv. So that was an interesting experience for me. It was interesting because all of the Jewish people around us, it was like every day for them. So they're just kind of like, kind of going down into their bomb shelters, and whereas Americans going, what in the heck is going on? And so it was an incredible trip.
Pastor Stephen, I have to tell you also that, visiting your church yesterday and speaking with the people there, because I spent a fair amount of time after each service, there were 2 services, really talking to people and having them share with me their thoughts and their feelings about Israel. And I really got a sense that you have done a great job. You have really connected them emotionally and spiritually to what's going on in Israel. And it could be that it was a self-selecting group, those who came over to me to talk to me, but it was a fair number of people. And I really felt the love and I felt the awareness. It wasn't like I visit a lot of churches in America, and there are many churches I walk into and it's kind of like this is a brand new thing. And it wasn't brand new for them at all, even though I imagine that there haven't been too many Orthodox rabbis from Israel standing up there on a Sunday. In your church, one of the things that struck me most, and that really, in our conversations, was your approach to education. And I want to mention two things and just let you pick up from there. One is that when we were talking about what I was going to speak about in the church, you said to me, hey, we're just finishing Genesis, so maybe something on Genesis. And that's why I decided to speak about some prayer scenes from the book of Genesis. But I thought that when you said we're just finishing Genesis, that you were talking about some sort of, Sunday school thing. And for the Jewish listeners, in Christian terminology, Sunday school is adult education that usually takes place either after the service or before the service on a Sunday. I thought you meant something like that, some classes outside of the regular service, or on Wednesday evenings. Very often churches will have a Bible study midweek. That's what I thought you meant. But in fact, what you were referring to was that Sunday morning from the pulpit at the main service, your preaching goes chapter by chapter. You go through the Bible, beginning at Genesis, and you're taking your church through the Bible as a church. So I want you to talk about that because it's highly unusual. I wouldn't say it's unique. I hope there are other churches that do it. But what led you to that, and what effect do you think that it's having? Talk about that whole idea.
That's an incredible jumping off point. That kind of goes back to my experience in Israel, my passion for Bible study. The Bible just has always been there. I've read the Bible through several times, but actually putting my feet on the ground, seeing things kind of reinvigorated this passion for the Word. And then 2020 happened, and all of the things that entailed, all of the culture wars, all of the things going on. And honestly, as a pastor, I was completely shocked at how much even members of our church, in our congregation, they've been in the church for decades. They didn't know the very basics of the Bible. They didn't know and understand the narrative. And so when faced with all this cultural stuff, they really didn't have the worldview that I, as a pastor, thought that I was giving them. And one of the things we've just decided to do over the last several years is just go deeper. For years in the church growth movement, we haven't had a whole lot of pressure in the United States. We've kind of softened a little bit of our message. Services have gotten shorter. Events and different things that we do, we kind of pulled back. It's kind of been a seeker-sensitive thing. And I wouldn't call us seeker-sensitive. I would call us seeker-aware. But we've got to teach the people the Bible. And so one of the things we decided to do this year is we created a devotional, and we called the series Story of Scripture. And it has 7 essentially like chapters or series inside of it where we're going through the main stories and themes of Scripture on Sunday. And then our Wednesday night service is even deeper than that, covering some of the big things that maybe we miss going through it. But perhaps the most transformative part of what we're doing is we're challenging our church to read through the Bible chronologically in order all the way through in a year. And it blows my mind at how many believers haven't actually read the entire Bible from cover to cover. And so that's really been a focus. And I'll tell you, our people, we have 2 groups of people. One group, they're just coming back to faith. They're looking at our culture. They maybe have some type of faith in their background, and they're returning because they're seeing the world essentially go crazy. And then you have another group of believers that have been in the church for a very long time, but have never really been challenged to ask some of the big questions. This is one of the reasons why your message was so powerful on Sunday, is it was because, I've often thought of this, as a Christian, I get introduced to the Bible when I'm introduced to the person of Christ. I give my life to Christ, and then I learn the Bible. But as I've hung out with my Jewish brothers and sisters, I realized that they didn't learn the Bible. They were born in the Bible. And just the depth that you gave on Sunday was so perfect for our series, because there's so much more than meets the eye. And even just some of the interpretive strategies and some of the things that you added, really, really blessed our church. And so that's been my mission it'll be my mission until I die. I mean, at the end of the day, the number one job I have is to make sure that I can help our people know the word of God, have a biblical framework so that they can be wise when the culture is coming at them. And so, yeah, anyways, it's been a great kickoff. We just started our first of 7 series all the way going through the Bible. We're getting ready to start Exodus, which I'm very excited about. So I may end up having you back. Anytime you're in Dallas, I'm going to be yanking you down here and, hey, come down here and do what you did last time. So,
well, and I know that you're not just teaching them the Bible so that they can consume, because one of the problems in the church is we've eaten too much and fought too little. And so I know that you are about putting that into practice. You engage the culture, you engage in politics, you engage in that space. And I think in some circles you take some heat. Pesach does the same. Steve Bannon affectionately calls Pesach the MAGA rabbi.
He's my spirit animal, by the way. Steve Bannon is my spirit animal. That, like, yeah, he's like my grumpy grandfather that I just love and need to just listen to. I
Your
love
grumpy Catholic grandfather.
I love it. I love it.
But that is a serious consideration when you're pastoring a church. You know, people will say, Pastor, leave politics out of the pulpit and you'll take a little heat. But you have boldly stood up, particularly during a time where people have said, well, the country's so divided, be a unifier. And you have stood up boldly with your convictions and you have not shied away from those conversations and being a voice of reason and wisdom in the culture. Talk about that. What does it cost you and why you have so boldly called your church to that place?
Yeah, well, the truth of the matter is I think the seasons have changed. You know, one of the things that Rabbi Pesach said this weekend is something that I've been talking about for the last several years, and Christians need to know what time it is. You know, we have different seasons and there's different ebbs and flows, and I don't want to throw out, you know, all that came before and how people built churches, but they did it in a relative time of peace. And the Bible's very clear. There's a time to love, there's a time to hate. Rabbi Pesach, you quoted Ecclesiastes this weekend. There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. And what I noticed, I'm probably wired a little bit more for conflict. Conflict's never really bothered me. People calling me names. I've kind of been uncancelable, you know, and so I've never really felt the pressure of that. So part of that is definitely temperament. God also placed us in right outside of Fort Cavazos, formerly Fort Hood, hopefully to be returned to its original name soon, but it's the largest U.S. military installation in the world. And so I have a church that's 80% active Army. I mean, we are literally a warrior church. And you know, when you read the scripture and you read about all of these stories in the word, these are people who didn't listen. Yahweh was the highest. Like they didn't put their faith in a separate bucket than their politics or any other area of their life. And so, you know, that's kind of a false line that has been okay in a time of peace, but in a time of war, you know, I always tell people in our church, you know, if you don't like what comes out when you're under pressure, don't blame the pressure. Change what's in.
That's good.
And you know, that's kind of what we've seen in the church. We've seen like the pressures come out. We've seen some of this ugly stuff, or the pressures hit us and some of this ugly stuff's come out of the tube. And it's like, we need to ask ourselves, well, what are we putting in there? Because you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of your preparation. And that really is what we see in the Bible. And so I don't actually, I think the seasons have changed, and so I think a more aggressive approach to culture. I mean, politics just means public square. So you telling me that our belief system shouldn't work itself out in our life? I mean, what kind of faith is that? That's not faith at all. I mean, you have faith. It changes the way you behave. It changes the way you interact. I mean, and even in the New Testament, Jesus says, like, woe when everyone speaks well of you. He didn't say woke. He said woe. Like, that's not good. If nobody's noticing that you're different, if nobody's noticing that you're contrary to many of the things in culture, then you're probably not living out your faith, at least as the Bible defines it. So that's been our posture, and the church has grown. It's exploded.
And that's the key point. You know, Doug, in his question, teeing you up, asked you if you've sacrificed anything by taking these positions. And it turns out, and I saw this yesterday and in our conversations, that on the contrary, you didn't do it because it's good business. You did it because it's the right thing to do. But in the end of the day, people are attracted to that. I think especially now, there are so many clergy, rabbis, and pastors alike. This is not a knock on either community. We have this in both communities, who kind of out of this self-righteous sense of piety, they'll say, oh, I don't talk politics from the pulpit. I don't want to mix politics and faith. And it's like, read the Bible. Like, Abraham was involved in politics, and Joseph was involved in politics, and Moses was involved in politics. And politics is about the world. It's about the battles that we're fighting. It's about the story that begins with Genesis and ends at the end times. And we're right in the thick of it right now. And to not mix politics and faith in this current moment, it is an act of cowardice as far as I'm concerned. So that's where I stand on this issue. And I understand where clergy are coming from. A lot of them are not really leaders. They're actually just, forgive me, they're the hired help, or they're kind of like program directors at some sort of spiritually inclined community center. And to really be a leader, one has to be willing to step out. And yes, there will be some feathers ruffled, but more often than not, more and more people will be attracted to it. People are looking for leadership. They want conviction from their leadership. And I think that you're really, taking things in the right direction in that regard. Pastor Stephen, I want to talk about what you've done in terms of schooling. One of the big recurring topics on this podcast since its inception, and I noticed our producer Scott's email sending out the link for today, that it's episode 175. Doug, could you believe that? 175
wow,
episodes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And one of the recurring topics ever since the beginning, one of the first few episodes has been education. And there's been a personal journey that Doug and Sam have gone through with their children in their move from Ohio up to New York and transferring their kids out of the government school system, what is erroneously called the public school system. I think we should speak frankly. People who send their kids to quote-unquote public schools are choosing to have the government educate their children. And Doug and Sam courageously really went through it was a lot of soul-searching involved, and it happened on this podcast in real time. There was conversations that we had on the podcast, and then this whole journey to make the right decisions about the education of their children. And one of the recurring themes in those conversations has been that in the Orthodox Jewish world that I come from, it is unheard of almost. It's the rare exceptions for people to not send their kids to a Jewish school. It's pretty much universal that we educate our children in our faith. And in the Christian world, I think there's so much damage that has been done by people thinking that, an hour and a half on a Sunday morning and maybe showing up on a Wednesday is going to undo what happens in the government schooling. And you've taken a very bold approach to that. So why don't you talk about what you're doing there at Vintage? Because I think that this is so important, especially there's a lot of pastors who listen to this podcast, and I want them to not turn it off, listen carefully to what Stephen is saying. This is a big, big fight we have.
Yeah. So just to be clear to any pastors listening, if you would have told me 5 years ago that we would launch a school, I would have said you're crazy. For a couple reasons. Number one, I grew up in a church where it was they started a school. It was an incredible amount of effort and energy. It tended to kind of take away from the church side. So I had a little bit of a negative thought on it there. I also considered the fact that while I live in Texas, our schools are fine, right? Well, wrong. I started to realize that really our entire education system, K through 12, is rotten to the core. I started to see that in 2020. My kids were enrolled in a public school. I had a very bad experience with a librarian trying to tell me that it was none of my business as a parent what was in their library or what the kids read in her library, as if they were her kids and not my kids. That was a pretty rough experience. From that moment, I unenrolled all 4 of my kids. I took them all out the same day. I put them into a Christian school, and this Christian school, in all honesty, it's great, but it was essentially the same chassis of education with a cross on the wall. And so I started realizing, even in some of my interactions with this school, which had been around since the 80s, I realized that they were using terms like, these are my kids, I'm taking care of my kids. And there was a real adversarial attitude to parents. And what I did it was a journey for me. I'll be honest. At the beginning, I was like, when God started to say to me, hey, you're going to start a school here. I was like, I don't know, Lord. It was about 2 years of wrestling before we actually did it. But here's what I realized. I realized that without even thinking about it, I had outsourced the training of my children to the government. And I love that you said that, Rabbi Pesach, because it's true. They're not public schools; they're government schools, and it's interesting. We train our kids in our home and in church, but you don't realize. They're in public school from K through 12, 16,000 hours by the time they finish. I pulled some stuff that is just so interesting on this. I called it the 16,000 hour war when I started realizing it. So 16,000 hours, okay, that's 43% of their waking hours from the time they're in kindergarten all the way through 12 years of age. If we think we're going to be able to compete with that without starting schools, we're absolutely insane. And, as a pastor, one of the things that I kind of fell back on, and this was kind of an argument that I had to kind of overcome, was, I read passages in the scripture that talk about how Christians are supposed to be salt and light. And that was always kind of put on. Well, if we pull out of the public schools, there's only going to be darkness there.
Absolutely. It's something I wrestled with. Absolutely.
Dude, here's what I learned in 2020. There's already darkness there. It's absolutely overwhelming. And as I started studying scripture, this is important, is I started to realize that our children are sponges before they're able to be salt and light. And when you read the passages of scripture, it is very clear that the parent and the faith community, we are the primary educators of kids. And I started reading passages like Proverbs 22, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Woe to anyone, Jesus says, who causes one of these little ones to stumble. Proverbs, and also all through Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, we see train up a child in the way they should go. It's our responsibility. And so, I started going down this path. A couple things I realized, it wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it was. Mainly because these people who we've given education to really aren't that smart to begin with. And they're just not. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really overcomplicated. They have all of these extra things. Most of the times our kids are doing nothing. I would rather them be with me. And so we embarked on essentially starting a school. And so we started the school, Vintage Christian Academy. We're in our second year. We have over 200 students. I will tell any pastor here, it is the greatest return. I call it ROM, return on ministry, that we've ever had. I told you this, Rabbi Pesach, when you were here. I said, I think we probably started the school so that God could or started the church so that God could get me to the school. It's just unbelievable. My kids are in it, and it's just been going incredibly. It's just been going great.
You mentioned that word responsibility, and I know for me, that was a huge turning point in my thinking. I had been raised in public school. I was a product of public school. I felt like I was supposed to be salt and light and all of that. But as Pesach and I dialogued through that, and you can go back, check out those episodes, we went back and forth. And one of the things that he taught me is that in the Hebrew, the root for teacher and parent play off of one another. Why don't you share that thought again with everybody?
Yeah, the Hebrew word for parents are horim. Hara is pregnancy, right? But horim are parents. Morim are teachers, and lehorot is to teach, meaning it's really the same word. Parenting is a teaching role. That's in the Hebrew, in the etymology itself. That's really what the word parent in the Hebrew means. It means to be a teacher. You're the primary educator of your children. And yeah, this goes back to all those conversations that we had, but it wasn't an easy journey for you, Doug, with Sam. Stephen, you're talking about how you have 200 students in the school, even though you started it 2 years ago. And again, speaking to the pastors who are listening, who they think it's such a burden and it's such a sideshow, and you now saying that you think that the church is really there to create the school, even from a purely business perspective, because so many pastors are so obsessed with numbers and how many people are in the church and who do they have and who are they losing. Talk about the impact from a purely business end perspective in terms of church growth that the school has had on the community.
Yeah. So first of all, to any pastor wanting to start a school, the first thing you've got to decide is what kind of school you're going to start. Rabbi Pesach, we talked about some mutual friends at Turning Point USA. They started an organization called Turning Point Academy, which is essentially planting classical or Christian classical schools. And so what was interesting is we started to investigate the difference between the Prussian model, which is essentially the chassis that all of our public schools, most of our Christian schools right now are built on, versus the original classical model that all of the founders of our nation, really all the way up to the late 19th century, this is how everyone
Talk
was
about
educated.
Those distinctions for people who don't know what you mean.
Yeah. So the idea of education from the Prussian model is essentially to give kids skills, to essentially help them build widgets. That's the focus of the entire education. Whereas the classical model, which was the only education model of our nation before that time, all the way up to its founding, is based on teaching virtue, teaching right and wrong, teaching morality. And what our founders knew in this education system is that they'll get to building great things and doing wonderful things, okay? But you've got to start with essentially giving them a worldview. And the truth is, no matter what you say, you are grooming your kid. Either you're grooming them as a parent or you're letting the state groom them. They're going to be groomed in a biblical worldview, right? Judeo-Christian ethic, or they're going to be a secular humanist worldview. Those are really the only two options. And so picking the classical model was really good for a few reasons. Number one, the cost structure is just so different. I mean, we essentially were able to cut down a whole lot of cost in terms of teachers and just kind of the style of how we do things. It has 3 levels, and you can Google Turning Point Academy. Classical U is also a great resource for you to kind of find out about this. But what's neat about our school is I essentially had no idea how we were going to do it, but I knew God wanted us to do a classical Christian school. So then as I started investigating it, one of the things we've done in our school is I just took it to the church and I said, listen, I want to be able to say yes to every qualified parent and child that wants to do it. And so in order for us to do that, this is going to be a ministry of Vintage Church. I don't see it differently. It is a ministry of Vintage Church. It's not its own separate thing. It is literally at the heart and soul of what we do. What's neat about that is we've activated all of these retired, some of them are retired teachers. Some of them are, we have a retired engineer teaching our math course for our middle schoolers right now. And he's doing it completely free. So 60% of our church's staff is actually volunteer. We're not an evangelism school. Me and Rabbi Pesach were talking about that a little bit. We have a process that makes sure that parents understand their role, and we essentially partner with the parent, but we're not the parent. And so we have to make sure our values are aligned. And so we have a whole interview process, but we're a discipleship school, meaning that we require some things. We require that they're active in a local church. It doesn't have to be ours, but they have to be active somewhere, and we check it every single semester. We also have rules we kind of pre-decide how we're going to do things and how we're going to resolve conflicts. And I was joking, but I kick out more parents than I do students, because if the values aren't right, you're going to cause all kinds of problems in the community. And I'll tell you, as a result, it's one of the most. All 4 of my kids are in it. I laughed at our church. I went to them and I said, "Hey, you guys think I'm starting this school for you, but I'm not starting this school for you. I have a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old. I'm starting it for me, but it's going to bless you." And so there's lots of things that you can do, to really get started. The neat thing about churches, and this is what's so incredible, the biggest lie that the public establishment, the government establishment will tell you is that parents they're not qualified to educate their kids. That is simply not true. You are actually not only qualified, you are the most qualified. God would never tell you to do something in his word and then have you give it to someone else. And the reality is God's ordained, parents to do this. And as we partner with parents, it's incredible. The vocabulary, classical education goes back to the classics of Western civilization. They still teach reading, writing, arithmetic, math, and science. We have all of those same things, but a much more rigorous program, and our students thrive. And what's neat about the classical program is if you do it right in the younger grades, you're teaching the kids to become self-reliant. And so actually you actually need less teachers as you grow through it. And so, yeah, any pastors interested in doing it, I think it's a great model, but from a strictly return on ministry investment, there's nothing better we've ever done. It's in the black. I wouldn't say that we're making tons of money because we highly scholarship. We put all of our profits back into scholarships, but it's not costing the church any money. And our church is full Monday through Friday. I can't tell you how many churches are only open on a Wednesday night service. They have these giant facilities and they're only open on a Sunday, and that facility is unused. Ministry is happening here all the time, and it's the best thing we've ever done.
And it means that the people in your church are in community, in fellowship with each other all week long. They're one big community. Their kids are going to school together. When they show up in church on Sunday, it's not just a once a week thing. And then you have summer programs for them. And it ends up building, again, even if we look at it purely from a perspective of keeping your numbers and building your numbers and building out your church, the commitment that people have to the church community is so much more robust.
Well, they're vested in them. Their kids go to the same school. They're in the same. See, this is the genius of it. And I never would have thought this before. You typically see it as a drain on expenses, but we've had parents that have come. We require that you're connected to a local church. We've had parents that have come and been like, I'm not really connected. I don't know if this is going to work. They come to our church. They become members of our church. Come back and enroll their kids, and now it's really discipleship for the entire family. Another thing that we do that's pretty neat is we only give 50% scholarships. So we will only, per qualified, their income or whatever, we will only give
maximum
50%. And then they can get 100% scholarship, but the last 50% they have to work off hourly as parents in the school. And so, and the parents have all different kinds of gifts. I mean, we have people coming in and doing science fairs for us. That's their thing for the semester, for their tuition. They've done community gardens. They've come in and helped us with field trips. I mean, really, it is an actual partnership. It's not adversarial. It's like we're all kind of working together, overcoming things. It's been great for the community. The church has also grown. Just in terms of profile, you run a great school. People talk and share. I can't tell you how many new families we've had come through the door because they've heard about our school, or they've connected with something in a sports league, and that they see the logo on the jerseys of the sports leagues, and they go, "What's that?" Well, it's at Vintage Church. Oh, I've heard about that church. I'm going to go give it a try. And so we've had lots of new members. The church has just exploded as we've taken biblical stances on morality, but also as we've not just been talking, we're actually going to solve the problem. That was the biggest conviction I had, is I can sit around and complain about the public school system, and pastors, listen, there is plenty to complain about. You go down that dark rabbit hole, it is ugly. But it's not just enough to see that there's a problem. We have the solution. It's our churches. Our buildings are made for schools. We literally are a school. I mean, a PAC, that's our auditorium. We have kids' classrooms. All of our kids' classrooms turn into school classrooms during the week. It's like a mobile school. It sets up after church on Sunday, and it closes down for Wednesday. It sucks back in on Wednesday, gets set back up, and then again for the weekend. And it's again been one of the greatest things we've ever done.
You mentioned sports leagues and all of that. How do the extracurriculars work at a Christian school? One of the critiques as we were looking into homeschool and looking into Christian school is, well, your kids aren't going to be well-rounded if you pull them out or you put them in a Christian school. You're going to put them in this bubble, and they're never going to interact with any other kids, and they're not going to get the same opportunities with music and athletics. How does that work?
Yeah, they're also not going to be transed. They're also not, I mean, just go through the list. It's so funny when people want to talk about socialization. By the way, the best way you can socialize your kid is to be with your kid. I mean, one of the things we talk to our parents about a ton is we're so overemphasizing like their need to build best friends. It's like, no. When they're in our home, the most important relationship they need to develop is their relationship with us. With like, we want to forge that connection. We only get so much time, and then they're out into the world. And what I've realized is socialization, that's a myth. And by the way, they're in the church community anyways. And so they're surrounded by people who love God. I mean, we're not like, taking them to some one-room schoolhouse in the middle of, Montana somewhere. I mean, they're in the community. Now, when it comes to sports leagues, we have all kinds of options, and they're in every state, in every community. You have public leagues. You can join. The church just sponsors teams. And so we join other leagues. And so there's some great outreach that kind of happens there as our parents, interact with other parents and they see how our kids act different. We've had many, many people come up to us just blown away by the maturity, by just the character and respect that our kids have in those public environments. And a lot of the parents that are going to be focused on that, I would just challenge the Christian parent. Do you care that your kid goes to Harvard or heaven? Do you care that like they're the best soccer player ever, or like they're a committed Christ follower, or they're strong in their faith? Like at some point, you do have to reevaluate like what you want your outcome to be. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of socialization, you get that all the time. And these are coming from the same places that, with the pink-haired jihadis in our classrooms, saluting the pride flag, wanting to tell us that our kids aren't going to be socialized. Give me a break. They're just going to come out like, I don't know, normal. I think we need to bring normal back. Like, no, our kids are just normal.
I want to make an observation about this in terms of the larger culture war that we're in the midst of, that I believe we're winning, but I believe we're in the midst of it. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be some more casualties along the way. And that is that the birth rate in America is not great. We know that. People aren't having enough kids. But those who are having kids, and the only communities in which the birth rate is healthy, are communities of faith. And what that means is that if Christian parents stop sending their kids to government schools, then there's no one else for them to indoctrinate because they ain't having kids. The people doing the left-wing progressive indoctrination aren't getting married. They're not having children. The next generation of indoctrinated progressive leftists are going to be the kids of Christians who go to those schools because those are the only kids there are. And the way to win the culture war, an essential ingredient in winning that culture war, is just set up your own schools. Pull them out of these government schools. Cut off the oxygen of the progressive movement. They won't have anyone to indoctrinate. There's so many reasons this is the right thing to do. What I'm saying is not the primary reason. The primary reason is what we said before. The Bible says you shall teach your children. I mean, it's right there. And like we said, parenting is an educational relationship. That's what it is. It's a relationship of instruction, of guidance, and that's what education is all about. Teachers are the messengers, as they were. They're the agents of the parents. The parents are the ones who educate. So I got to tell you, I was so inspired by the structure of your community, by the approach that you're taking to your ministry, by the messaging, the boldness, the willingness to take stands. And God has shown you in the growth of your church that rather than that being, pastors who are listening, if you think that it is a risk, you're taking a risk of losing people if you make a stand, yes, there will be some people who walk away. You weren't going to reach them anyway. You were going to attract many, many more people. I remember back in COVID when all the churches in Doug's area were closing because of the COVID regulations, and Doug decided to stay open. His church grew as a result of that. By taking a bold stand, we grow because people are looking for conviction. They're looking for truth. They're looking for real direction. And we have to do what's right. And God bless you, Stephen. I'm so happy we met. I got a new best friend. It's been really, again, I'm very inspired by your community, a very young, vibrant church, and you should only know more growth.
As we come to a close, Pastor Stephen, I know you're also an author and you do a lot on social media. So how can people get a hold of some of your books? How can people stay connected with you? How can they follow you? And if pastors are interested in starting a school, is there a way they can reach out and connect and maybe ask some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things I'll just kind of throw at you. Obviously, our church website is vintage.church. You can kind of see how everything's kind of structured and reach out to us there. You can also email me directly at Stephen, Stephen, at vintage.church. That will definitely get to me. In terms of a lot of the resources, I do a lot of coaching for pastors in revitalization. I do a lot of different things. You can actually go to a nonprofit that I have called churchsherpa.com. That's churchsherpa.com. A lot of my books are up there. I also make available at a very, very small cost all of my teaching notes. You can get those there, download those, modify them however you want, and use them. And then obviously our Under God podcast, it's everywhere podcasts are. It's a video podcast. We also have it on Spotify and iTunes, Rumble and YouTube. It's all over there, but you can just go Under God podcast with Pastor Stephen and you'll see all that there.
Awesome. Well, it was great to have you on. Good to see your face. Good to hear your voice. Can't wait to be down in Texas again, have you back up here in Buffalo.
Heck yeah, just not in January. I'm coming to Buffalo in the summer.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Under God podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and leave us a review. Your support helps us reach more people with our content. You can stay connected with us on True Social, Facebook, Instagram, and Getter. And don't forget to subscribe on Rumble, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify so you never miss an episode. You can also access show notes and other resources on our website at undergodpodcast.com. See you next time, and remember to think biblically about the things that matter most.